on a dry, restless night in 1875. A gate swings open in the dead of night. A 7-year-old girl stands there, barefoot, dust caked up to her knees, dragging a broken cradle behind her. In her arms is an infant, cheeks flushed bright with fever, breath rattling thin and short. "Please, just one night," the girl whispers, her voice barely surviving the wind. The man in the doorway freezes. 3 years now, he hasn't touched the dusty medical bag buried in the back room. Not since the night he couldn't save his own wife and son from a fever that showed no mercy. His eyes lock onto the dying baby in this stranger's arms, and his hands, steady through war and surgery alike, start to shake. "What's his name?" he asks, voice rough. "Sam. He's my brother. Everyone said you used to be a doctor." One decision, made in the space of a single breath, is about to drag this broken, isolated doctor into a war against a ruthless railroad tycoon, against a whole town that's learned to look away, and against the grief he spent 3 years trying to bury for good. What happens to the doctor, the 2 orphaned children, and the secret hidden in the land they're fighting to keep? Hit follow and watch the full story now. You won't want to miss a single second of it. The wind came first. It always did. Out here on the Kansas plains, rattling through dry grass like something restless, something that couldn't sleep. Silas Thorne heard it before he heard the knock, or what passed for a knock. 3 small uneven taps against the gatepost. He almost didn't get up. 3 years of nights like this one, silent and long, had taught him to ignore most sounds. The wind lied, the dark played tricks. He'd learned that the hard way, back when he still believed his hands could outrun a fever. But the taps came again, softer this time, almost like they were running out of strength. Silas pulled himself off the cot, boots hitting the floorboards, and crossed to the window. What he saw stopped his breath cold. A little girl stood at his gate, barefoot, dust caked up to her knees, like she'd walked through every dry mile between here and nowhere. She couldn't have been more than 7. And behind her, dragging through the dirt on a rope tied crooked, was a cradle. Broken. One rocker snapped clean off. He was out the door before he even thought to grab his coat. "Please," the girl whispered, when he got close enough to hear. Her voice barely carried over the wind. "Just one night, please." Silas knelt down. And that's when he saw the baby. Small, too small, wrapped in a blanket gone gray with travel. Cheeks flushed a deep, dangerous red. The baby's breath came in short, rattling pulls. Silas had heard that sound before. He'd heard it the night his own son couldn't fight any longer. His hands went cold. For 3 years, Silas Thorne hadn't touched another living soul who needed saving. He'd buried his bag in the back room, behind the coats, behind the years. He told himself the world had plenty of doctors. He told himself he was done. But the baby's breath was getting shorter, and the girl was looking up at him with eyes that had already seen too much. "What's his name?" Silas asked. His voice came out rougher than he meant. "Sam," the girl said. "I'm Lily. He's my brother. He's burning up. And I didn't know where else to go, and everyone said you used to be a doctor. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry to wake you, but he's burning up." She said it all in one breath, like she'd been holding it the whole walk over. Silas didn't answer. He just scooped the baby up, careful, the way his hands remembered, even when his mind had tried to forget, and carried him inside. Lily followed without being asked, dragging the broken cradle through the door, because she wasn't about to let go of the last piece of home she had left. Inside, by lamplight, Silas finally opened the bag he hadn't touched in 3 years. The leather had gone stiff, the clasp stuck, but his fingers knew where everything was. Even in the dark, even after all this time, he felt the baby's forehead, felt the heat radiating off that little body like a stove left burning too long. He listened to the lungs, counted the pulse. His hands shook, just slightly, the way they hadn't shaken in surgery even once. Not back when the bullets were flying and the table was slick with blood. They shook now because this baby's life was small enough to fit in his 2 palms. He worked fast, cool cloths, a careful dose. Measured twice because his mind kept drifting somewhere he didn't want it to go. Lily sat in the corner, knees pulled to her chest, watching him with the kind of stillness only children learn too early. The stillness that comes after losing something you can't get back. Is he going to die, she asked. Flat, like she already expected the answer to hurt. Silas looked at her, really looked, saw the dust on her bare feet, the rope burns on her small hands from dragging that cradle, the way she'd walked through the night with a fever-sick baby, and never once thought about turning around. Not tonight, he said. Not if I can help it. It was the first promise he'd made in 3 years. The fever broke a little after 2 in the morning. Silas sat in the chair beside the cradle, watching the baby's breathing even out, watching the red drain slowly from those small cheeks. Lily had fallen asleep on the floor beside him, exhausted past fighting it, her hand still resting on the edge of the broken cradle, like she needed to keep one finger on what was left of her family. Silas didn't sleep. He sat in the lamplight and watched 2 children who weren't his, in a house that hadn't held warmth in 3 years, and he felt something crack open in his chest that he'd worked very hard to keep sealed shut. He'd told himself he was done with this, done with hoping, done with hands that could only save some and not others. But the baby's chest rose and fell, steady now, and the girl slept easier than she probably had in days. And Silas understood, sitting there in the dark, that a man could close his door to the whole world. He just couldn't close it on a knock like that. By the time the sun came up over the dry fields, Silas Thorne had already decided. Whatever happened next, however long this lasted, these children weren't going anywhere. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not as long as he had breath left to fight for them. Morning came hot and dry, the way every morning had come for months now. Silas Thorne stood in his kitchen, looking at an empty flour tin and a baby who needed formula he didn't have. Lily sat at the table, picking at the hem of her dress, watching him with eyes that hadn't slept enough. We need supplies, he said, mostly to himself. Can't keep him on broth and prayer. He hitched the wagon before the sun cleared the ridge. Lily climbed up beside him without being told, holding her brother close. Like she'd decided somewhere in the night that wherever Silas went, she went too. He didn't argue. 3 years of silence had taught him plenty about loneliness, and the girl's stubborn trust felt like something he didn't want to break. The ride into town was quiet. Dust kicked up behind the wheels. Lily hummed something low, a tune Silas didn't know, probably one her mother used to sing. He let her hum. It was the first sound that had filled his wagon in a long time, and he wasn't in any hurry to silence it. Main Street looked the way it always looked. Sun-bleached boards, a general store with a faded sign. Folks who'd learned to look away when Silas Thorne came through town, because a man who buried his family and his medical bag in the same season wasn't a man you wanted to bother with small talk. But this morning, eyes followed him. Word traveled fast in a town this size. And word had already gotten around about the doctor's gate, and the dust-covered girl, and the baby with the fever. Silas felt the stares. He ignored them. He had a job to do, and it didn't involve explaining himself to anyone. He'd just stepped down from the wagon, Lily's hand tucked safe in his, when 3 riders came around the corner of the feed store. Big men, hired men, the kind that didn't work cattle, didn't work fields, just worked trouble for whoever paid the most. Silas recognized the lead rider's coat. Clayton Briggs didn't ride into town himself for jobs like this. He sent men who didn't mind getting their boots dirty. "Morning, Doc," the lead rider said. He wasn't smiling. "Heard you picked up some strays." Silas didn't answer. He set Lily a half step behind him. Slow, easy, like he was just shifting his weight. "County's got an orphanage," the man went on. "Proper place for kids without folks, mister. Briggs is a generous man, pays for their keep out of his own pocket. Be a shame if word got around that some lonesome doctor was keeping children that ain't his against the law. There's no law that says a child can't be cared for by whoever's willing," Silas said. His voice was flat, steady, the kind of voice he used to use in surgery, when panic helped nobody. "There's law enough, if Mr. Briggs wants there to be." The second rider's hand drifted toward his holster. Casual, just resting there. A warning dressed up as nothing at all. Silas didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have one on him. Hadn't carried one in years. Not since he hung up that part of his life, along with his medical bag. He just stood there, between three armed men and two children who had nobody else. And he opened his coat instead, slow, showing them what he did have, his medical bag. "You boys want to pull that trigger," Silas said. "You go right ahead. But I'd think real hard about it first." The lead writer frowned. "That a threat, Doc?" "It's a fact." Silas's eyes didn't move off him, didn't blink. "I'm the only man in 3 counties who can dig a bullet out clean, set a broken bone so it heals straight, or bring down a fever before it cooks a man's brain in his skull. You shoot me, or you shoot anybody standing near me, and you better pray you never catch a fever, never break a leg, never take a bullet of your own, because there won't be a soul left in this territory who can keep you breathing." Nobody moved. The wind picked up dust along the street, the only sound for a long, stretched-out moment. "These children," Silas said, "quieter now, are under my medical protection. That baby had a fever last night that could have killed him in his sleep. You want to explain to Clayton Briggs why his hired guns let a sick infant die in the street because they were too busy posturing. Go ahead. Right on back and tell him that." The lead writer's jaw worked, like he was chewing on something he didn't like the taste of. He looked at his partners. They didn't look eager either, whatever they were being paid. It probably wasn't enough to gamble against a man who'd just promised to let them rot if they ever needed stitching up. "This ain't finished," the writer finally said, pulling his horse around. "Didn't say it was," Silas answered. They rode off slow, the kind of slow that was trying to look like they weren't retreating, even though everybody on that street knew exactly what it was. Silas felt his hand shaking again. Same as last night. He looked down. Lily was gripping his coat with both fists, baby Sam still cradled against her chest, her face pale but her chin set hard, like she'd decided crying wasn't going to help anybody today. "You're safe," Silas told her. "Both of you." From the boardwalk across the street, a young woman in a gray traveling dress had watched the whole thing without moving. Eleanor Vance had heard the stories about Silas Thorne, same as everyone else. The ghost of a doctor. The man who'd buried his grief out past the county line and never came back from it. She'd pictured someone broken, someone closed off and cold. She hadn't pictured a man who'd stand unarmed in front of 3 guns to protect a stranger's children. She crossed the street before she'd fully decided to. The townsfolk nearby had already started their whispering, the way small towns do, careful and quiet, and ready to look the other way. The second trouble came calling again. He just stood there, one woman murmured to another. Just stood there and let them point guns at him. Eleanor turned on them, sharper than she meant to. "And what would you have had him do? Hand the children over to Clayton Briggs because it's easier than getting involved." The women fell quiet. "The safety of an orphan," Eleanor said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "is the moral measure of this entire town. Every single one of you. Silence in the face of tyranny is just another form of complicity. You can whisper about it on your porches tonight, or you can do something about it. Your choice." She didn't wait for a response. She walked straight up to Silas, who was still catching his breath, still holding Lily's hand like he wasn't quite ready to let go. "Eleanor Vance," she said, "I teach school here. Looks like you could use some help getting that baby fed before he wastes away in your arms." Silas looked at her for a long moment. 3 years of silence had made him forget what it felt like, having somebody look at him like he wasn't a ghost. "Silas Thorne," he said, "and yes, I could." Eleanor came out to the ranch 2 days later, riding her own horse with a basket of supplies tied behind the saddle. Flour, tinned milk, a small bottle of medicine she'd bought from the apothecary, just in case the fever decided to come back uninvited. Silas met her at the gate, arms crossed, looking like a man who hadn't decided yet whether he wanted company. "You didn't need to come all this way," he said. "I know I didn't need to." Eleanor swung down off her horse without waiting for help. "I wanted to. There's a difference." He didn't have a good answer for that, so he just held the gate open. Inside, the house was clean but bare. No pictures on the walls, no warmth in the corners, Eleanor noticed it the way she noticed most things, quiet without comment, filing it away. A house like this didn't happen by accident. A house like this happened because a man had decided not to let himself remember what a home used to feel like. Lily was sitting by the window, watching the road, the way children do when they're still waiting for someone who isn't coming back. She brightened a little when she saw Eleanor, though enough to come closer and peer into the basket. Is that for the baby? Some of it. Eleanor knelt down to her level. Some of it's for you, too. I figured a girl your age might want something other than broth and worry to fill her days. She pulled out a small slate chalkboard, a stub of chalk tied to it with string. Lily's eyes went wide. I had one of these before. Well, now you've got one again. Silas watched from across the room, arms still crossed, but something in his face had eased. Just slightly, like a man remembering how to stand without bracing for bad news. Over the following days, Eleanor came out often. She helped boil water for the baby's formula, helped change linens, helped keep Lily occupied with letters and sums, while Silas tended to the never-ending list of chores a ranch demanded, even one running on nothing but stubbornness and grief. Silas was gruff at first, short answers, long silences. He'd spent 3 years building walls, and he wasn't in any hurry to knock them down just because a schoolteacher kept showing up with milk and chalk. But Eleanor's stubbornness matched his, measure for measure. She didn't push, she didn't pry. She just kept coming back, kept setting up that little chalkboard in his kitchen, kept humming under her breath while she worked, until the silence in that house started to feel less like a wall and more like a held breath, waiting to be let out. One evening, while Eleanor bathed the baby in a tin basin and Silas held the lamp steady, their hands brushed reaching for the same cloth. Neither of them pulled away as quick as they should have. You don't talk about them, Eleanor said quietly. Your wife, your boy. Silas's jaw tightened. No, you don't have to. I just want you to know I see it. The way you hold that baby, like you're afraid he'll disappear if you blink. The way you watch Lily sleep like you're standing guard against something that already happened. Silas set the lamp down slow, careful, the same way he did everything that mattered. His name was Daniel, he said. The words came out rusty, like a door that hadn't opened in years. He was 4. There was a fever that came through, fast, meaner than anything I'd seen overseas. I lost him on a Tuesday. Lost his mother 3 days after that. I had every medical book this side of the Mississippi in that house, and none of it mattered. None of it saved either one of them. Eleanor didn't say anything right away. She just reached over and took his hand, the one still damp from the basin water, and held it. That's not a failure. Silas, she said, that's grief. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight for 3 years, finally let go, just a little. The next morning, Eleanor set the chalkboard up properly in the kitchen, the way a real schoolroom might, and called Lily over. Education and the truth, she told the girl, drawing the first letter of her name in careful chalk, are your armor. Lily, they are the only weapons no man can ever steal from your mind. Money can be stolen. Land can be stolen. But what you learn, what you know, what you understand about the world and your own worth in it, that belongs to you forever. Lily traced the letter with her small finger, slow and careful, the way you trace something you mean to keep. Silas watched from the doorway, and for the first time in 3 years, he let himself believe that maybe this house could hold something other than ghosts. The explosion rattled windows 3 miles off. Silas heard it from the barn, felt it more than heard it, a deep shudder through the ground that meant something had gone badly wrong at the railroad camp. Word came an hour later, carried by a boy on a winded horse. A blasting crew had set their charge wrong. A worker named Tom Halloran was buried under rock and timber, both legs crushed, chest caved in something terrible. Clayton Briggs had taken one look at the wreckage and gone right back to overseeing the next section of track, same as if nothing had happened at all. He said the man wasn't worth the delay, the boy told Silas, voice shaking. Said if Halloran wants doctoring, his family can pay for it themselves. Silas was already grabbing his bag. He rode out to the camp himself, against every instinct that told him not to get involved in Clayton Briggs's business any deeper than he already was. But a man bleeding out under a collapsed beam wasn't business. It was a life, and Silas Thorne had decided 3 years too late, and one little girl's midnight knock too recently, that he wasn't in the business of turning his back on lives that needed saving. He brought Tom Halloran back to the ranch in the bed of his wagon, the man's breathing shallow and wet, his face the color of old ash. Eleanor was there within the hour, summoned by the same boy who'd carried the first warning, and she set to work as nurse without being asked twice. The surgery took most of the night. Silas worked by lamplight, Eleanor steady at his side, passing instruments, holding pressure, doing whatever needed doing without flinching, without asking questions that would only slow his hands down. It was the kind of work that asked everything of a person and gave nothing back but the chance that someone else might live to see morning. Tom Halloran lived to see morning afterward, exhausted, hands still trembling from hours of careful, desperate work. Silas and Eleanor sat on the porch steps together, watching the sky lighten over the plains. "He works for the man trying to steal those children's land," Eleanor said quietly. "You know that, I know it. And you saved him anyway." Silas looked out at the horizon. The same horizon that had swallowed his wife and son 3 years ago. The same horizon he'd stopped expecting anything good from. A man's lungs don't ask who he works for before they decide whether to keep breathing. Silas said, "I didn't take this bag back up to pick and choose who deserves to live. The day I start doing that, I'm not a doctor anymore. I'm just another man with a gun, deciding who matters and who doesn't." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "My father disinherited me," she said finally. "Did you know that? Cut me out of everything. The land, the money, all of it. The day I turned 18 and told him I intended to teach, instead of marry whoever he'd picked out for me," he said. A woman's opinions weren't worth the paper to write them down on. Silas turned to look at her properly. "He was wrong. I know he was wrong." Eleanor's voice was steady, but there was an old hurt underneath it, the kind that doesn't go away so much as it gets carried differently over time. But knowing it and having the world agree with you are two very different things. I spent a long time being told my worth was tied to what a man decided to give me. Land, money, permission. I came out here, started teaching, built something of my own, because I refused to keep waiting for someone to hand me a life I could have built myself. Silas reached over and took her hand, the same way she'd taken his that night at the basin. "You did build it yourself," he said. "Nobody handed you a thing." Inside, Tom Halloran stirred in his sleep, alive, because a man had decided that mercy didn't come with conditions attached. Down the hall, Lily slept curled around her brother, safe for one more night, because two people had chosen, again and again, to do the harder thing instead of the easier one. Clayton Briggs would hear, by midday, that his injured worker had survived under the care of the very doctor, sheltering the orphans he wanted gone. He would not take the news well. But for one quiet morning, on a porch overlooking the dry Kansas plains, Silas Thorne and Eleanor Vance sat together in the kind of silence that didn't ask to be filled. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because for the first time in 3 years, the silence finally felt like peace instead of grief. The smell woke Silas before the sound did. Smoke, sharp and wrong, curling in through the bedroom window on a wind that shouldn't have been carrying anything but dust this time of night. He was up and moving before his mind caught all the way up to his body. Out the window, the barn was burning, not smoldering. Burning, flames already climbing the near wall. Orange light throwing long shadows across the yard. Silas didn't waste time wondering how it started. He already knew. There was only one man in this county who'd benefit from watching his barn turn to ash. Eleanor. He was already pulling on his boots. Get the children to the root cellar. Now, Eleanor didn't argue. She'd learned these past weeks that Silas Thorne didn't raise his voice unless the moment called for it. And this moment called for it plenty. She scooped Sam up from his cradle, grabbed Lily's hand, and moved fast toward the cellar door, while Silas ran barefoot across the yard toward the flames. The horses were screaming. That sound, more than the fire itself, was what put speed into Silas's legs. He'd heard men scream in pain before, more times than he cared to count. But there was something about an animal's terror, raw and uncomprehending, that cut straight through a person. He hit the barn door at a dead run and threw it open. Smoke rolled out thick and black, stinging his eyes near blind. But he could hear the horses kicking against their stalls. Frantic, and he went in anyway. The first horse, his gelding, came easy enough once Silas got the stall door open, bolting past him toward the night air. The second, a mare close to spooked out of her mind, reared and caught Silas a glancing blow across the shoulder that sent him stumbling into the wall. He shook it off. No time to feel it yet. He'd feel it later, if there was a later. He got the mare's lead rope, talked low and steady into her ear, the way he used to talk to frightened men on a surgery table, and got her moving toward the door just as a support beam overhead gave way with a groan and crashed down behind them both. Outside, gasping Soot-streaked, turned back toward the barn just long enough to see one more shape stumbling near the wreckage. Not a horse, a man. One of Clayton's hired hands, the one who must have set the fire, had gotten himself too close to his own handiwork. A panicked horse, kicking blind through the smoke, had caught him square in the ribs. He was down in the dirt, gasping, clutching his side, flames climbing closer to where he'd fallen. Silas didn't think. That was the truth of it. When Eleanor asked him how he'd decided so fast, he didn't think at all. His legs just moved, carrying him back into the smoke, toward a man who'd come here to burn his home down. And his hands did what they'd always done, what they were built to do, which was reach for somebody who needed pulling out of the fire. He dragged the man clear, just as the wall behind them collapsed in a shower of sparks. By the time the flames died down to smoldering ruin, the barn was gone, but every horse had made it out alive, and so had the man who'd set the blaze. Silas knelt over him in the dirt, checking his ribs with the same careful hands he'd used on Tom Halloran weeks before. Why, the hired hand wheezed, staring up at Silas like he couldn't make sense of what had just happened. "Why'd you pull me out?" "I burned your barn. Your ribs are broken, not your character," Silas said. "One of those I can fix tonight. The other's your business." It was only afterward, in the gray light before dawn, sorting through the wreckage for anything salvageable, that Lily came running out of the cellar with her old coat clutched in both hands, the lining torn open, empty. "It's gone," she said, voice cracking the deed. "Papa sewed it in here before it's gone, Silas. Somebody took it." Silas felt his stomach drop clean through the floor in all the smoke and chaos. One of Clayton's other men had slipped in and stripped the one thing that mattered more than any of it, the deed to the land, the only proof, the only future. Lily and Sam had left. Silas didn't sleep that night, and he didn't try to. He sat in the kitchen long after Eleanor had gotten the children settled. The lamp burned low, and his old cavalry revolver laid out on the table in front of him like it had been waiting all this time for him to remember it was there. He'd carried that gun through a war. He'd told himself after that he was done with it, same as he'd told himself he was done with doctoring, until a barefoot girl proved him wrong about one of those things already. Maybe he'd been wrong about the gun, too. Clayton Briggs had taken everything from two children who'd already lost their parents to him once. The land, the water, the only inheritance that stood between them and nothing. Silas figured there were only two ways this ended now. The law, slow and uncertain and easily bought. The way Eleanor had taught him to believe in. Or the fast way. The way that had nothing to do with belief at all. He was checking the cylinder when Eleanor walked in. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at the gun, then at his face. And whatever she saw there made her cross the kitchen fast, putting herself between him and the door. "Don't," she said. "Eleanor, don't you dare ride out of here tonight?" Her voice was shaking, but she didn't move. "I know what you're thinking. I can see it all over you." He took the deed, Eleanor. He took the only thing standing between those children and losing everything their parents died for. "You want me to just sit here. I want you to be the man I've watched these past weeks. not the man you're about to become if you walk out that door with that gun in your hand. Silas stood up so fast, the chair scraped back hard against the floor. And what would you have me do? Wait for a circuit judge who might show up next spring. Wait while Clayton Briggs forges new papers and buries the truth 6 feet under like he buried Lily's parents. I would have you remember who you are. Eleanor's hands came up, gripping the front of his shirt, holding on like she could physically keep him from leaving. You are a man who pulled an enemy out of a burning barn 3 hours ago. You are a man who saved Tom Halloran's life, even though he works for the devil himself. That man does not become a killer in the dark. Silas. That man does not ride to Clayton's Manor and paint the walls in blood. He deserves worse than what I'm planning. Maybe he does. Her grip tightened. But if you shoot him in the dark, you are just another killer. Silas. We don't fight monsters by becoming them. We drag them into the light. We fight with the law so Lily learns that justice is real, that it actually means something, that the world isn't just men with guns deciding who wins. If you ride out there tonight, you don't just risk your own life. You teach that little girl that the only answer to cruelty is more cruelty. Is that the lesson you want her carrying for the rest of her life? Silas stood there, breathing hard, the gun still cold and heavy in his other hand. I can't lose them too, he said, and his voice broke on the last word. 3 years of grief, finally cracking through all at once. I already lost Daniel. I already lost Anna. I can't stand here and lose this too, Eleanor. I can't. You won't. Eleanor's hand slid up to his face, holding him steady, forcing him to look at her instead of the dark window behind her. We won't. Not like this. Not by becoming exactly what he already is. And then, before either of them quite decided it was happening, she kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was desperate. The kind of kiss that carried every fear and every held breath from the past several weeks. And Silas, for one long moment, forgot the gun in his hand entirely. When they finally pulled apart, he was shaking, but not with rage anymore. Promise me, Eleanor whispered against his forehead. Promise me you'll fight this the right way. Silas looked down at the revolver, then set it back on the table, and slowly, deliberately, unbuckled the gun belt and let it fall. I promise, he said. The annual summer gala had been planned long before any of this started, back when the worst thing on anyone's mind was the drought cracking the fields dry. Now, with the deed stolen, and Clayton Briggs circling like a vulture who smelled blood in the water, Silas almost didn't want to go at all. Eleanor convinced him otherwise. If you hide out at that ranch, she said, helping straighten his collar in front of the cracked mirror, Clayton wins twice over. He gets the land, and he gets the satisfaction of watching you crawl into a hole and stay there. We are going to that gala, and we are going to smile. And we are going to make that man so uncomfortable he forgets which fork to use. Silas almost laughed. It had been 3 years since he'd worn a suit that wasn't for a funeral. The gala was held in the town hall, lanterns strung along the porch, fiddle music drifting out into the warm evening air. Half the county turned out, dressed in their best, and more than a few heads turned when Silas Thorne walked in beside Eleanor Vance, clean-shaven, hair combed, looking less like a ghost and more like a man who'd remembered how to live. Clayton Briggs was there too, of course, holding court near the punch table, surrounded by men who laughed a half-second too late at whatever he said, the way men do around someone holding all the money in a room. Eleanor crossed the floor straight toward him before Silas could stop her. "Mr. Briggs," she said, sweet as honey gone sharp at the edges, "would you do me the honor of a dance? I find myself in need of a partner who can keep up a conversation as well as he keeps up appearances." Clayton, caught off guard, recovered quick enough to take her hand, probably figuring it made for good optics, dancing with the schoolteacher in front of the whole town. He had no idea what he'd just walked into. "Tell me, Mr. Briggs," Eleanor said as they moved across the floor, "do you believe a woman's opinion on property rights carries any weight at all? Or do you reserve your respect strictly for men with deeds in their pocket?" Clayton chuckled, the sound a little too tight. "I believe a woman's opinion carries plenty of weight, Miss Vance, in its proper place. And where exactly is its proper place, in your estimation? Somewhere that doesn't involve interfering with railroad business. I'd imagine how fortunate, then, that I have no interest in railroad business. Eleanor's smile never wavered. I only have interest in orphaned children, keeping what rightfully belongs to them. Tell me, does it trouble you at all? Taking land from a 7-year-old girl who watched her parents die. Clayton's jaw tightened. Business is business, Miss Vance. How convenient an excuse for a man with no conscience to hide behind, while Eleanor kept Clayton's full attention occupied. Razor sharp and relentless, Silas slipped out through the side door into the warm dark. The mayor's office sat 2 buildings down, same office Clayton had been using as his unofficial base of operations for months now, paying the mayor's silence the way he paid for everything else. The window latch gave easy enough under Silas's knife. 3 years of patching up cattle thieves and outlaws had taught him things a respectable doctor probably shouldn't know. Inside, by the thin moonlight through the window, Silas searched fast desk drawers, a locked cabinet that gave way after a few hard tries. And there, finally, tucked beneath a stack of railroad surveys, the deed. Lily's deed, creased and worn from its years, sewn into a coat lining, but intact. He almost left right then. But something in that locked cabinet caught his eye on the way out. Ledgers. Pages and pages of numbers that didn't add up to railroad expenses at all. Payments. Dates. Names of state judges Silas recognized from court appointments and circuit rulings. Bribes. Clayton Briggs had been buying judges, same as he bought hired guns. Silas tucked the ledgers under his coat alongside the deed and slipped back out into the night. Heart pounding. Already knowing this changed everything. This wasn't just about one piece of land anymore. Back at the gala, Eleanor was just finishing her dance. Clayton looking thoroughly rattled by an hour of conversation he hadn't been prepared for. When Silas reappeared at the edge of the room, coat buttoned, just slightly different than before. He caught Eleanor's eye across the crowded floor and gave the smallest nod. She smiled back, the kind of smile that knew exactly what it meant, and excused herself from Clayton's company without a hint of the satisfaction she clearly felt underneath. "Did you find it?" she whispered. Once they'd found a quiet corner. "Found that, and a good deal more," Silas murmured. "Clayton Briggs isn't just stealing land, Eleanor. He's been buying judges to make sure nobody can stop him." Eleanor's eyes went wide, then sharp, then something close to fierce. "Then it's time," she said. "We let the whole territory see exactly what kind of man he really is." Clayton Briggs discovered the theft the next morning, and the whole town felt the fallout by noon. A messenger came pounding up the road to the ranch, breathless, warning that Clayton had torn his office apart, looking for the missing ledgers, and that he knew, somehow, exactly who'd taken them. By the time the sun started sinking that evening, Silas had already barred every window and dragged the heavy oak table against the front door. "You think he'll really come?" Eleanor asked, helping him wedge a chair beneath the back door latch. "I think a man who spent months trying to steal land from orphans isn't going to suddenly grow a conscience because we embarrassed him at a dance." Silas checked the lock on the last window. "He's got nothing left to lose now. Those ledgers prove he's been buying judges. That's not a fine. That's prison." Lily sat at the kitchen table, watching them both with wide, careful eyes. The same stillness she'd carried since the night she first showed up at the gate. Sam slept in his cradle nearby, blissfully unaware that the world outside had turned dangerous again. The first sign of trouble came just after dark. Hoofbeats, a lot of them, moving steady and deliberate up the road toward the house. Not a single rider this time. A whole gang of them, torches already lit, throwing long orange light across the yard. "Get down," Silas said, pulling Eleanor and the children away from the windows. "Stay low." Glass shattered somewhere in the front room. A rock or a bottle thrown hard enough to crack the pane. Outside voices shouted, rough and confident. The kind of confidence that came from numbers and torches, and not much fear of consequence. "Briggs wants what's his," one of them hollered. "Hand over them papers, Doc, and maybe we leave you standing." Silas didn't answer. He'd learned a long time ago that answering men like that only gave them more to aim at. A shard of glass caught Lily's arm as she crawled past the broken window, a thin red line opening up along her forearm. She didn't cry out, just pressed her hand over it, and kept moving toward the cellar door like Silas had taught her, quick and quiet and steady. "Let me see," Eleanor said once they were huddled in the back hallway, pulling Lily's sleeve back gently. The cut was shallow, nothing that needed more than a clean cloth and pressure, but Eleanor wrapped it anyway, slow and careful, murmuring something soft the whole time. The way you talk to a child when the real danger is everywhere except the wound in front of you. Outside, the shouting grew louder. Something heavy thudded against the barricaded front door. Silas stood in the hallway, every instinct from the war rising up in him. The old calculations of cover and timing, and how many men he could realistically hold off with nothing but a barred door and his own two hands. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. There were too many of them, and only one of him standing between Clayton's gang and the only family he had left. He thought about Eleanor's words from a few nights before, "We fight with the law." But the law felt very far away right now, with torches lighting up the yard and the smell of smoke already curling back into his memory from the barn fire just days ago. Then through the chaos, he heard something else, hoofbeats again, but different this time, more of them, coming fast from the direction of town. "Get back from there," a new voice bellowed, older, rough with authority. "Every one of you, get back." Silas risked a look through the cracked window. Deputy Miller had arrived, badge catching the torchlight, rifle raised. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, stretching back along the road, as far as Silas could see, came lanterns, dozens of them, bobbing in the dark, carried by men and women on foot, on horseback, in wagons. Farmers, shopkeepers, the blacksmith, the woman who ran the boarding house. Tom Halloran himself, still favoring his healing ribs, riding at the front with a shotgun across his lap. "This here ranch is under the protection of this whole town," Deputy Miller shouted, his voice carrying clear across the yard. "Any man lays a hand on that house answers to every single person standing behind me." The hired guns hesitated, torches lowered, just slightly, as the sheer number of townsfolk became impossible to ignore. They'd come expecting one stubborn doctor and an empty road. They hadn't expected an army of lanterns. Silas stood in his shattered doorway, watching the standoff unfold, and felt something tighten in his throat that had nothing to do with fear. These were people who 3 years ago had let him disappear into his own grief without a second glance. People who'd whispered about him on the boardwalk, called him the town ghost, looked away whenever he passed. Now here they were, standing between his family and a gang of armed men, simply because he'd chosen, again and again, to do right by whoever needed help, whether or not it benefited him. Good deeds ripple outward, Eleanor had told him that more than once these past weeks, and he'd believed it the way a man believes a kind sentiment, hopeful but uncertain. Watching it happen in front of him, watching neighbors risk their own safety because of a debt they felt toward a man who'd saved an enemy's life out of pure stubborn principle. That was different. That was proof. Clayton's hired men didn't stay to find out how far the town's resolve would stretch. One by one, they wheeled their horses around and rode off into the dark, torches sputtering out behind them, leaving nothing but hoofprints and the smell of smoke drifting over the yard. Deputy Miller swung down off his horse and walked up to the porch. "Hat in hand, sent word to the marshal 3 days back," he said, "soon as I heard what Briggs was up to with that land. Figured we'd need more than just me, and a tin badge to settle this proper." Silas looked past him, at the dozens of lanterns still glowing along the road, neighbors who'd come out into the dark for a man they barely knew a month ago. "Thank you," he said, and found the words weren't nearly enough. "Don't thank me," Miller said. "Thank yourself. You're the one who showed this whole town what decency still looks like." The U.S. Marshal arrived the next morning, dust still clinging to his coat from the long ride in, a folded warrant tucked inside his vest. Deputy Miller had wasted no time getting word out, and by the time The marshal's horse came up the road. Half the county already knew a reckoning was coming. They held the trial that very afternoon, right there on the wooden porch of the church, because nobody wanted to wait one more day for justice that had already waited 3 years too long. The whole town turned out under the glaring summer sun. Eleanor sat beside Silas on a borrowed bench, Lily tucked between them. Sam asleep in Eleanor's arms despite the noise of the gathering crowd. Clayton Briggs sat across the aisle. Flanked by 2 lawyers, he'd clearly paid handsomely. His expression a careful mask of wounded innocence. The circuit judge, summoned along with the marshal, took his seat at a makeshift bench. The stolen ledgers laid out in front of him like evidence of a sin too large to hide. These records, the judge said, voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd. Detail payments made to no fewer than 4 sitting judges across 3 counties, in exchange for favorable rulings on land disputes connected to Mr. Briggs's railroad expansion. That is not business, Mr. Briggs. That is corruption, plain and simple. Clayton's lawyer rose smoothly. Your Honor, these ledgers could have been forged. Planted. We have only the word of a disgraced doctor and a schoolteacher with a personal grudge against my client. I'll have a witness who isn't either of those things, the marshal said. He called the name, and a murmur ran through the crowd as a man stepped forward, arms still strapped tight against his ribs. The very man who'd set the barn fire, who Silas had pulled out of the flames with his own 2 hands. Tell the court what you know, the marshal said. The man's voice shook, but he didn't stop. Briggs paid me and 3 others to burn the thorn barn, said if the doc wouldn't scare off proper. We were to make him understand what happens to folks who get in, Mr. Briggs's way, same as what happened to the Vance family's land deal last spring, and the Coopers before that. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd at that. Names of families who'd quietly lost land over the years, never quite understanding why, suddenly making horrible sense. And why, the judge asked. Are you testifying against the man who paid you? The hired hand looked over at Silas, something raw and grateful crossing his weathered face. Because he pulled me out of a fire, I set myself. Didn't have to. Could have left me there and called it justice. Instead, he set my ribs and let me sleep under his roof while they healed. Never met a man do that for somebody who'd wronged him. Figured I owed him the truth, at least. The judge nodded slowly, then turned his attention to the heart of the matter. There is also the question, he said, of the murder of this child's parents 3 years past. A crime long suspected but never proven, connected to this same dispute over water rights. The courtroom went still. Lily's small hand tightened around Eleanor's fingers. I don't want her testifying, Silas said quietly to the marshal. She's 7 years old. She doesn't have to, Eleanor said just as quietly. But I think she wants to. Lily looked up at both of them, her chin set. In that same stubborn line, Silas had seen the very first night she showed up at his gate, dragging a broken cradle through the dust. To tell, she said. I want everyone to know what he did. She walked up to the front of the church porch on her own 2 feet, small and steady, and looked Clayton Briggs dead in the eye. The men who came that night, she said, voice trembling but clear. They said, Mr. Briggs sent them, said it before they hurt my parents. I heard them say his name. I never forgot it. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Clayton's composed mask finally cracked, just slightly, just enough for the whole town to see the fear underneath. The marshal didn't wait for further deliberation. He crossed the porch, pulled Clayton Briggs up by the arm, and slapped iron cuffs around his wrists. Clayton Briggs, the judge declared, gavel coming down hard against the makeshift bench. You stand charged with bribery, arson, conspiracy, and complicity in murder. Human dignity is not a commodity to be traded, and the rights of a child cannot be washed away by corporate greed. Justice belongs to the people, not to whoever holds the deepest pockets. The crowd erupted, not in celebration exactly, but in something close to relief, the kind that comes after holding your breath far too long. Lily stood very still in the middle of it all, watching the man who'd taken her parents finally get led away in chains. And Silas crossed the porch to kneel down in front of her. You did good, he said. You did real good. For the first time, since that midnight knock at his gate. Lily let herself cry, not from fear this time, but from something closer to relief, finding its way out at last. The rain came 3 days after the trial, the first real rain the county had seen in over a year. It started slow, fat drops striking the dry earth and disappearing instantly, soaked up by ground that had forgotten what water felt like. Then it came harder, steady, washing over the cracked fields and parched grass until the whole world smelled like something new beginning. Silas stood on the porch and watched it fall. Eleanor beside him, both of them soaked through within minutes, and neither one minding at all. "Feels like the whole sky's been waiting on this," Eleanor said. "Feels like a lot of things were waiting," Silas answered, and the way he looked at her left no question what else he meant. The court had granted legal guardianship of Lily and Sam within the week, the judge citing not just Silas and Eleanor's clear devotion to the children, but the overwhelming testimony of an entire town willing to vouch for their character. Clayton Briggs's confiscated assets, including the considerable fortune built on stolen land and bribed judges, went toward restitution for every family he'd wronged over the years. The Coopers got their land back. The Vances, distant cousins of Eleanor's own family as it turned out, received their share too. Lily's deed, the one sewn so carefully into the lining of an old coat, was returned to her properly, framed under glass, hanging now above the fireplace where she could see it every single day and know exactly what her parents had fought to leave behind for her. A few months passed, quick the way months do once happiness gets involved. Silas and Eleanor married on a Sunday afternoon, a small gathering at the church. The same porch where justice had been served now, decorated with wildflowers that had finally found enough rain to bloom. Half the town came, the same neighbors who'd carried lanterns through the dark to stand guard over a family that had become, somewhere along the way, their own. The ranch looked different now, too. The burned barn had been rebuilt, bigger this time, sturdier, with the whole town pitching in to raise the new walls in a single determined weekend. One half of the house had been expanded into a proper schoolroom. Rows of small desks where Eleanor taught not just Lily, but a dozen other children from families who could no longer afford the schoolhouse in town. The other half remained Silas's clinic, doors open to anyone who needed tending, paying customers and grateful strangers alike. Because that's what he decided. A long time ago, a doctor was supposed to be, on a warm afternoon. Sunlight finally breaking clean and gold across fields, turning green again after the drought. Silas stood on the front porch and watched Lily teaching a cluster of local children how to read. The same chalkboard Eleanor had first brought out all those months ago, propped up against the porch railing, beside him in the rebuilt cradle, painstakingly repaired, sanded smooth, and painted a soft warm blue. Baby Sam slept peacefully, no longer the fevered, fragile thing that had first arrived at this gate in the dead of night. Eleanor came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her head against his back. "Hard to believe," she murmured, "that broken old cradle started all of this." Silas turned, pulling her close, watching Lily laugh at something one of the other children said, watching the life that had grown up around a house that used to hold nothing but silence and grief. "A family," he said quietly, "isn't just blood, it's choice, sacrifice. The courage to open your door in the dark, even when you've got every reason in the world to keep it shut." Eleanor smiled up at him, the kind of smile that held 3 years of healing in it, and a whole lifetime still ahead. "Then I'd say," she said, "you've built yourself quite a family, Doctor. Thorn, out in the yard." Lily looked up from her makeshift classroom and waved, bright and unburdened. A little girl who'd once walked barefoot through the dust, now standing in the sun. Finally, fully, home. As this story comes to a close, we are left with more than the image of a rebuilt ranch, a sleeping baby, and a little girl finally standing in the sunlight. We are left with a truth that belongs not only to the old Kansas plains, but to every human heart. Sometimes the smallest knock at the door can change the entire course of a life. Silas Thorne began this journey as a man buried alive by grief. He had lost his wife, his child, his faith in his own hands, and nearly his faith in the world. He believed that closing his door was the only way to survive pain. But when Lily came barefoot through the dust, dragging her sick baby brother in a broken cradle, she did not just ask for shelter. She brought Silas back to the man he had always been beneath the sorrow. She reminded him that mercy does not wait until we feel strong. It begins the moment we choose to answer someone else's need. The lesson of this story is that true courage is not always found in gunfire, revenge, or loud declarations. Sometimes courage is a doctor opening an old medical bag after years of fear. Sometimes it is a schoolteacher standing in the street and telling a silent town that looking away is also a choice. Sometimes it is saving the life of an enemy because a human life should never be measured by hatred. Silas could have allowed bitterness to define him, but again and again, he chose decency. Eleanor could have accepted the limits placed upon her, but she chose truth, education, and justice. Lily could have remained only a victim, but she found the strength to speak, to remember, and to stand before the man who had stolen so much from her. This story also teaches us that family is not only blood. Family is built in the long nights, in shared danger, in sacrifice, in the simple act of staying when leaving would be easier. Silas did not become Lily and Sam's protector because the law first gave him permission. He became their family because he chose them when they had no one else. Eleanor became their family because she brought light into a house full of ghosts. And the town became part of that family when it finally stopped whispering from the shadows and came forward with lanterns in the dark. That is one of the deepest values this story offers. Goodness may begin with one person, but it never has to end there. One act of mercy can ripple outward until an entire community remembers what it means to stand together. Clayton Briggs represents the kind of power that believes everything can be bought. Land judges silence even fear. But the story shows us that human dignity cannot be owned. A child's future cannot be erased by greed. Justice may be delayed, hidden, or threatened, but when brave people bring the truth into the light, even the richest villain can fall. And perhaps the most powerful part of Silas's victory is that he does not win by becoming like Briggs. He does not let vengeance turn him into the very darkness he is fighting. He wins by holding on to his soul. In the end, the rain that falls after the trial is more than weather. It is renewal. It is grace. It is proof that dry ground can bloom again, and so can a wounded heart. Silas Ranch becomes a home, a school, and a clinic because healing is not only about saving bodies. It is about restoring hope. For every viewer listening tonight, this story leaves a quiet but powerful message. Do not underestimate the good you can do by opening your door, speaking the truth, protecting the helpless, and choosing mercy when cruelty would be easier. In a hard world, kindness is not weakness. It is the strongest foundation a life, a family, and a community can ever be built upon. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.